When Clint Eastwood walked into the Monterey County Courthouse, calm and unshaken, the arrogant prosecutor, Elliot Graves, barely spared him a glance. To Graves, Clint was just an aging actor out of his depth, foolishly choosing to represent himself. What Graves didn't know was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, because Clint wasn't just fighting a legal battle. He was fighting for what was right, and when the truth came out, the courtroom was left in stunned silence. In true Clint Eastwood style, he turned the trial into a lesson in justice, one no one would ever forget. The Monterey County Courthouse was packed to the brim. Spectators filled every seat, some craning their necks from the back, eager to witness the legal showdown that had already gripped the public's attention. Reporters sat poised with notepads, while legal analysts whispered among themselves, debating the outcome before the trial had even begun. Then, Elliot Graves made his entrance. The arrogant prosecutor strode into the courtroom with the swagger of a man who already considered the case won. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor. He flashed a smug smile at the gallery before taking his place at the prosecution's table. His eyes flicked toward the defense, toward the man who had the audacity to challenge him. Clint Eastwood sat there, still as a mountain. Dressed in a simple dark jacket and a pressed shirt, he radiated quiet authority. There was no lawyer at his side because Clint was his own lawyer. He had made the bold decision to represent himself, a move that sent whispers rippling through the crowd. A mistake, Graves thought with amusement. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitmore settled into his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room before lifting his gavel. "We will have no theatrics in this courtroom," he warned, his deep voice carrying an unspoken "or else." The courtroom quieted. The case seemed straightforward, at least on the surface. The prosecution claimed Clint had unlawfully seized land belonging to Gerald Matlock, a powerful real estate developer with deep pockets and even deeper political connections. Matlock had been chomping at the bit to take over a large swath of land in the hills, land that just so happened to belong to Clint. According to Graves, Clint had ignored property lines, encroached on Matlock's legally purchased acres, and refused to comply with county orders. Clint's response? He sat there, expression unreadable, hands resting loosely on the table. No outbursts, no theatrics. Just a man who had been here before. The tension in the room was thick as the trial began. Elliot Graves rose from his seat with the air of a man who thought he was the smartest person in the room. He adjusted his cufflinks, stepped toward the jury, and offered them a smile, the kind a car salesman gives before trying to sell you something you don't need. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth, confident. "We are gathered here today because of one simple truth. The law applies to everyone." He turned slightly, eyes flicking toward Clint. "Even to men who have spent decades acting like they exist outside of it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clint didn't react. Graves smirked before continuing, pacing slightly in front of the jury. "The defendant, Mr. Clint Eastwood, is a man of many talents, an actor, a director, a public figure." His tone dripped with condescension. "But what he is not is a man of the law." A few chuckles rang out from the gallery. The jury shifted slightly in their seats, amused. Graves leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to draw them in. "This case is not about Hollywood. It's not about fame or legacy. It's about a man who thought he could take what wasn't his." He gestured toward Matlock, who sat behind him, smug and satisfied. "The evidence will show that Mr. Eastwood deliberately and recklessly ignored property laws. That he ignored warnings, ignored boundaries, and acted as if the rules simply don't apply to him." Another chuckle from the audience. Even the judge hid a smirk behind his hand. Graves turned to Clint now, as if speaking directly to him. "Mr. Eastwood made the bold choice to represent himself," he said, spreading his arms in exaggerated disbelief. "A curious decision for someone who, forgive me, has no legal background." Laughter rang out again, louder this time, and still, Clint did nothing. He sat there, watching, not blinking, not flinching, not giving Graves a single inch. Graves turned, back to the jury, his voice dripping with confidence. "You will see by the end of this trial that the law is clear. and that no matter how many movies a man has made, he cannot rewrite the rules. Satisfied, he stepped back and returned to his seat. The jury was nodding. The judge seemed ready to proceed. The audience was fully on Graves' side. And yet, something felt off. Graves glanced at Clint. And for the first, Clint was watching him. Not with anger, not with frustration, but with patience. Like a man waiting for the right moment. And suddenly, Graves wasn't as confident as he had been 5 minutes ago. A long silence followed his performance. The courtroom was still buzzing from his smug delivery, the jury still mulling over his sharp words. The air felt charged, thick with expectation. Then Clint Eastwood stood. No hurry, no theatrics. Just a slow, deliberate movement as he adjusted his coat and straightened his posture. Unlike Graves, he didn't strut, didn't pace. He simply stepped forward, rested his hands on the wooden defense table, and let the room settle. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, wasn't booming, but everyone leaned in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his tone smooth as sandpaper on polished wood. "I don't have a fancy speech for you." A pause. "I don't need one." The jury shifted. The murmurs in the audience stilled. Even the judge, who had barely been suppressing amusement moments ago, sat up straighter. "This is simple," Clint continued, his voice measured, carrying the weight of a man who didn't need to prove himself. "The law is the law, and the law says I own that land." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it between two fingers. "I have the deed. I have the records. I have the proof." Graves smirked at the display, but something in Clint's tone made the jury lean in. Clint unfolded the paper, smoothing it out on the table in front of him. "Mr. Matlock here," he said, glancing toward the smug real estate tycoon. "Thinks money gives him the right to take what isn't his. He thinks enough paperwork, enough legal tricks, enough influence will cover up the truth." Clint's eyes flicked up, sharp, focused. But the truth doesn't need tricks. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, just calm certainty. And suddenly, Graves's carefully rehearsed performance felt like a cheap stage play. "You'll hear a lot of words over the next few days," Clint said, scanning the jury. "But at the end of it, the facts won't change." A slow pause. A steady breath. "I didn't take his land." Another pause. "He took mine." Silence. The jury wasn't chuckling anymore. Graves shifted in his seat. Clint simply gave a slow nod, folded his paper back up, and sat down. No flourish. No mic drop. Just a man who had already said enough. And in that moment, for the first time, Graves realized he might have underestimated him. Clearing his throat, Graves rose to his feet. He wouldn't let Eastwood's theatrics, subtle though, they were, throw him off his game. "The prosecution calls its first witness," he announced, turning toward the doors. A neatly dressed man in a crisp business suit strode forward, Lucas Miles, Matlock's chief surveyor. He took the stand, adjusted the microphone, and faced the jury with a rehearsed professional smile. "Mr. Miles," Graves began, "you work for Matlock Development, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in your professional opinion, did Mr. Eastwood unlawfully prevent Matlock Development from accessing legally owned land?" Miles nodded, face serious. "Yes. Mr. Eastwood refused to remove fencing that cut into our development site. He ignored county orders and interfered with legally sanctioned construction." Graves turned, spreading his arms toward the jury. "You see? This isn't about legacy. It's about the law. Mr. Eastwood deliberately obstructed legal business operations." The jury nodded slightly. Graves smirked. He was back in control. "I'd like to submit Exhibit A," he continued, pulling out a stack of documents, official records from the county, showing Mr. Eastwood's multiple violations. The judge gestured for the bailiff to take them to the jury. The papers made their way around the box. Survey maps, zoning codes, legal notices. The kind of paperwork that could bury anyone who didn't know better. From his seat, Clint took a slow breath. He had seen this play before. Graves turned back to Miles. "One last question, Mr. Miles." His tone turned casual, conversational. Does Mr. Eastwood have any legal expertise? Miles chuckled. Not that I'm aware of. Graves spread his arms, his smirk widening. And there you have it. A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom. He turned toward Clint, cocking his head. Tell me, Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to be lost in a world you don't understand? More chuckles. A few outright laughs. Even Matlock hid a grin behind his hand. Clint didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He simply picked up his pen, made a single note on his yellow legal pad, then looked up, directly at Graves. Small thing. A nothing gesture. But suddenly, the laughter died down, because there was something in Clint's gaze. Not anger, not frustration. Something worse. Patience. And for the second time that day, Graves felt something he wasn't used to. Feeling doubt. The courtroom was thick with ante. Miles sat frozen, his lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came. Graves leapt to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is not a legal expert. These documents are... The judge raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Graves. I'd like to hear this. Graves clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding. Clint continued, pulling out a third document. This, he said, unfolding it with deliberate care, is a revised zoning map showing that Matlock's company expanded beyond their approved area, right onto my land. The jury leaned forward. Miles swallowed. Clint let the weight of the moment settle before leaning in just slightly. You're a surveyor, son. I assume you've seen this before. Miles blinked. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple, the jury noticed. The courtroom noticed, and for the first time, so did the judge. A crack had formed in the prosecution's case, and Clint had only just begun. Elliot Graves felt the pressure mounting. The jury was slipping. The energy in the room had shifted toward Eastwood, and he hated it. So as Clint returned to his seat, Graves shot up, straightening his tie. Time to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, pacing in front of the jury box, his tone thick with amusement. What you just witnessed was a wonderful example of old-school charm. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Graves smirked. Mr. Eastwood may be good at playing the tough guy on screen, but let's not forget, this is a court of law, not some old western. A small laugh from the audience. Matlock grinned. Graves felt his confidence return. He turned toward Clint, his eyes gleaming with arrogance. Tell me, Mr. Eastwood, do you actually believe a stack of old papers is enough to prove your case? Clint didn't blink, didn't move, just sat there, watching. Graves continued, feeding off the jury's mild amusement. Let's talk about actual evidence. He turned to the bailiff. Please display Exhibit C. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. The projector flickered to life, revealing an aerial image of the disputed land. Graves gestured grandly. This, he said, is footage taken by an independent drone survey which clearly shows that the property lines aren't as cut and dry as Mr. Eastwood claims. He pointed to the screen, zooming in. See here? The fence line is unclear. The supposed trespassing might not be so one-sided after all. More murmurs. The jury exchanged glances. Graves smiled. He had them again. But then, a voice. Low. Calm. Unshaken. Are you sure about that, son? The room froze. Graves turned. Clint was still sitting there. Still motionless. But now, there was something dangerous in his eyes. The judge sat forward. Even Matlock's smirk faded slightly. Graves's stomach twisted, because suddenly, he wasn't so sure anymore, and something told him Clint knew exactly what was coming next. The courtroom was still buzzing from Clint's last words. Graves had lost his smirk. His cocky attitude had been replaced with the tightness of a man who had just felt the floor shift beneath him. And Clint, he stood up slowly, walking to the center of the room with the same deliberate ease of a man who had spent his life knowing exactly when to draw his weapon. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense calls Jacob Reynolds to the stand. A murmur rippled through the crowd as an elderly man with silver hair and a firm posture made his way forward. Reynolds settled into the witness chair, adjusting his glasses. A man who had spent his career dealing in facts, Clint stepped closer. Mr. Reynolds, can you state your profession for the court? Reynolds cleared his throat. I'm a retired land surveyor. 35 years in the business. Clint nodded. And in your time surveying land, have you ever worked with Mr. Gerald? Matlock? Reynolds stiffened slightly, his fingers tapping the wooden armrest. I have. Clint's gaze was steady. And what did you find in your analysis of my property line? Reynolds reached into a folder and pulled out official county records, unaltered. Certified, he held them up. That Matlock's development encroached on your land by exactly 22 feet. The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel. Order! Clint remained still, watching Graves, whose jaw clenched ever so slightly. But Clint wasn't done. Mr. Reynolds, Clint said, his voice even, did Matlock or anyone from his team ever approach you about these findings? Reynolds hesitated. Then with a slow exhale, he nodded. Yes. Graves tensed. The judge raised an eyebrow. Elaborate. Reynolds looked right at Matlock, his voice steady. I was offered $50,000 to adjust my findings. When I refused, they threatened to ruin my career. A collective gasp. Matlock shifted uncomfortably. Graves shot to his feet.